Welcome to this webinar on CIHT's Experiential Learning Pathway to Chartered Engineer status. My name's Sue Stevens. I'm an Education Associate at CIHT, and I'm going to be joined today by Paul Murphy, who is a CIHT member and one of the first candidates to gain CEng through the Experiential Learning Pathway. So I'm going to start first of all by explaining who this route is for and how the assessment process works. And Paul will then go on to describe his experience, how he prepared his application, and all about the assessment process from a candidate's perspective. So first of all, there are two routes to professional registration as a chartered engineer, the individual route and the standard route. The standard route is for people who hold what we call an accredited qualification. And the accredited qualification or qualifications need to be at master's level. So someone with, for example, an accredited MEng or an accredited BEng Honours plus an accredited MSc would automatically satisfy the criteria for standard route and would go directly to what we call the professional review, which is the assessment of practical competence. There is another route, which is the individual route, which many of our members take, and that's for people who don't have an accredited qualification. So they're demonstrating master's level learning, but just in a different way. There are three options under the individual route with CIHT: the technical report option, the further learning report option, and the new experiential learning option. Once a candidate has satisfied one of these assessments, they can again proceed to professional review in the normal way and, if successful, gain registration status. It's very important from a candidate's point of view that you start off on the right foot. And so CIHT has what we call an initial assessment. And that all candidates must complete that. So even if you think that you might be standard route or you might be an experiential learning potential candidate, we ask you to go through the initial assessment phase. It's very straightforward. We're looking for an up-to-date CV and copies of academic certificates. It's free to apply. And the important thing is that we send you an outcome email that explains to you which route you are eligible for, and if it's the individual route, which of the options is open to you. So a very important stage to make sure, as I say, that you are starting on the right path and not wasting time, perhaps starting something that you're not in fact eligible to do. So the individual route, a little bit about the assessment process. We have assessors who are CIHT members and who are Engineering Council registrants themselves, and they consider the evidence of learning put forward by candidates to see if it matches the academic requirements, the benchmark requirements for CEng. And this evidence could be drawn from formal qualifications, it could be drawn from on or off the job training, and a lot drawn from practical experience. And then that's matched again against what we call the learning outcomes set out in the Engineering Council's Accreditation of Higher Education Programmes document. And if the match is a good one, that candidate can then proceed to the professional review. The learning outcomes cover 5 engineering-specific areas of learning. So that's science and maths, engineering analysis, design and innovation, the engineer and society, and engineering practice. So if all of the learning outcomes, the relevant learning outcomes, are demonstrated, the candidate then proceeds to professional review. If the evidence doesn't quite match, then the applicant is advised on where they need to supplement the shortfall, and then they can then reapply. So the option or the pathway we're going to focus on today is experiential learning. And this is a new pathway for CIHT. It was piloted in 2023, and Paul was part of that pilot group, and launched formally this year. It's available to CIHT members either with a partially accredited CEng degree, or so an accredited BEng honours, or IEng registration. In addition, applicants must have significant technical and managerial experience at a senior level. That's very important. And they must be able to demonstrate an advanced level of knowledge and understanding of engineering principles and practice in highways and transportation, including the ability to solve complex or non-routine engineering problems. So when you consider that the level of learning that we're looking to be demonstrated is master's level, you can see why this depth of knowledge and understanding is required. The evidence put forward needs to cover what we call the knowledge gap between a bachelor's, accredited bachelor's, and master's, as described in the learning outcomes. Examples of evidence are provided in the Joint Board of Moderators guidance document. So there is a document that's been put together by the professional engineering institutions who accredit degree and master's programs. That's the Joint Board of Moderators. And it's really to give you an idea as to the depth of knowledge required. So they might not absolutely fit your experience, but it will get you thinking along the right lines in terms of the complexity and the depth of the knowledge that we're looking for. So experiential learning has, as I say, various learning outcomes. The actual assessment process, the BEng honours accredited candidates will be required to provide evidence for 8 of the learning outcomes. And for IEng candidates, it would be 14. And we're looking again for critical analysis of 1 or 2 projects in which you've played a significant role. So it is about the applicant's knowledge rather than people they work with. And it needs to explain the relevant engineering and management theories and principles applied, the analytical methods and tools used, and their limits, and the knowledge that was gained through taking part in the activity. So those really are the sort of areas that we look for when you're presenting examples of your learning. There are word limits for the application, 4,000 for holders of a partially accredited degree, and 8,000 for IEng registrants. And that's because we're looking, the education, the learning gap between a BEng honours and an MEng is smaller than for IEng candidates who've demonstrated bachelor's without honours. So there's a slightly different starting point, which is why there are more learning outcomes for IEng registrants to satisfy. In addition to the examples of learning, we're looking for an up-to-date CV and a CPD record as part of the application. And an interview may be required, so it's not a mandatory part of the process, but if the assessors feel that they need slightly more information on certain learning outcomes, they may well require an interview to discuss those elements with the candidate. So important things to remember. Excuse me. Choose your examples carefully and be concise because there is a word limit. So you might well start off with quite a long, wordy example, but you do need to edit it down so that it's very concise and it absolutely focuses on the learning that you need to convey to the assessors. The assessors are learning for what you've learned and how you learned it. Some of the learning outcomes relate to management, but this is primarily about establishing your technical knowledge. You can include carefully selected appendices in your application, and that's to explain or add value. Again, carefully selected. You don't want to put lots of appendices in your application that really pad out the application but don't add value. So again, carefully selected is important. And ask your mentor or sponsor for advice throughout the process, and try not to just present them with your application at the end, because they do need to feel comfortable, particularly the sponsor needs to feel comfortable sponsoring your application. So they'll be more comfortable if they've seen what you've produced as it develops. So the next steps after this webinar, if you haven't done so, I recommend that you make an application for initial assessment to see if you're eligible for the experiential learning option. If you are eligible, so if you get an outcome email that tells you yes, that would be open to you, we'll also send you guidance and the application template. There are application deadlines which you'll need to look at. So 9th of February and 2nd of August this year are the deadlines. Make your application and pay the assessment fee, and the assessment fee this year is £225. I have mentioned that assessment may include an interview. The interviews are held online, and you get good notice of interview dates and details of how that will work. Once you've completed the assessment, our individual route assessor panel looks at all of the recommendations and confirms results. And if you're successful, you can then progress to the professional review. You're notified that you may now proceed. So all of this information is available from the education team at CIHT. If you have any queries or you want further information, please do contact them at education@ciht.org.uk. I'm now going to pass over to Paul Murphy, who is going to tell you about his experience of going through the experiential learning route. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Sue. Yep. So, as Sue mentioned, I was part of the pilot group who undertook the experiential review in 2013. So, just to give you a bit of background for myself, I'm an associate technical director with Arcadis. I've got 18 years experience. I've been highways lead on various schemes. I undertook the incorporated engineer qualification in June 2014, so 10 years ago. I passed the chartered manager review in July 2017. Then, as mentioned, successfully passed experiential learning route in April last year and undertook the professional review and was notified that that was successful in November 2023. So I just wanted to start with touching on the JBM guidance that I thought was particularly pertinent to the experiential learning route. So in the JBM guidance, they say that the master's level learning is typically demonstrated through the application of that knowledge and critical evaluation of the outcomes. So merely conveying knowledge and facts, even on highly specialist topics, is rarely sufficient to show the required master's level learning. So I thought that was quite pertinent, that, you know, it's quite clear that they want you not only to tell them about the first principles, but the critical evaluation of it and the outcomes is a really important part. And also the evidence required for a participant would typically only need one or perhaps two relevant examples of the engineer's work treated in depth. So, you know, you don't necessarily have to say you've done this a million times, but it's about the depth of the understanding. And that's what I took these to mean. So just to explain a bit about my approach to satisfying the learning objectives, and I would say that I agree with what Sue mentioned earlier about not just speaking to your mentor or sponsor at the end, speaking to them throughout the whole process is very important. So what I did was try to break down exactly what each section was asking for, plan out my best experience for the specific learning objective, and then agree that with my mentor before I got too far ahead of myself. So almost like doing a kind of paragraph plan for each one. Agree that with your mentor, you know, this is what I think is my best experience, this is what I'm going to expand on. If you do that, then I think you'll probably save yourself a lot of time in the end. So can give you some examples of how I did that, and what CIHT has fed back was one of the trickiest objectives was the science, maths and engineering principles. So it can be quite difficult in highways to figure out how you can satisfy this one. So my approach was, you know, look at exactly what they're asking for and obviously try and understand that first and then take it from there. So when it's talking about maths, statistics, natural science and engineering principles, for me, that's all really the first principles of design. So I try not to get too bogged down on trying to show examples of maths and statistics and things like that, and just treat it all as one subject really. And the way I did that was, you know, looking at a formula for it was stop and sight distance that I used, but looking at that formula and trying to show a real in-depth understanding of the parts of that formula and the variables that are in it and what those variables actually mean. Pardon me. And the second part to this actually further kind of outlines what you have to do. So you have to show solution of complex problems, including critical awareness of new developments and the wider context of engineering. So for me, that's, you know, you've looked at this formula or, you know, first principle, you've understood what goes into it, what the variables mean, then how do you actually use that to solve problems? And for me, I think that's it can't just be something that's sort of out of a design manual and you pick the standard and you say, oh well, it said the desirable minimum was this value, so that's what we did. It's more about proving something that doesn't come straight off the shelf. So for me, I think a departure is probably the best example, and that's what I used in my submission, because in a departure you're going to look at why is it still safe to use these design values, these variables that are less than what's in the design standards, and how can you prove that that's still safe? How can you analyze that and understand what the formula is telling you, what the first principles mean in that context of the design, and apply that in the real world. And then the other part of it, of the awareness of new developments in the wider context of engineering, for me, the way that I interpret that is, you know, you've got this formula that's got variables in it, and those variables were were worked out at a certain point of time. So, for example, stop and sight distance, it was in I think the 70s where the formula that's now in the DMRB was derived, and those variables were generated. So at that point in time, what were cars like? What were tires and braking systems like compared to what they're like now? And analysing how that impacts on the first principles of what you've actually worked out that this formula is doing. So that's what I did a lot in my submission, was look at, this is what the context was at this time. This is what it's like now, and this is what could be different in the future, to show how that formula was set in a point of time, but it will change over time, and those variables will change. So that it shows a depth of understanding to it, more than just working out values. Pardon me. So the next one, which people may think would be quite straightforward, but actually for myself turned out to be a difficult one to satisfy, was sustainability. So just to talk briefly about how I'd approached in my submission, what I thought was good and what I would do differently if I was doing it again. So in my submission, I highlighted how sustainability was incorporated in the design solutions that I presented in other sections of the submission, and made sure these were clearly referenced. And one thing that I used that I thought did come across well to the reviewers was the red, amber, green tables to assess all the impacts of design and show how the solution that you chose had the most positive impacts. So I thought that was quite a powerful way of showing how designs are compared, and how the solution was chosen. But what I would say was that it would be pertinent to look out examples of sustainable materials and carbon calculations for your schemes. And that will probably become more clear pretty shortly when I get to the interview. So I'll come back to that in a second. But one other tip for some of the other learning objectives, some of them, the text is quite wordy. So for problem analysis in particular, it is very wordy, and the way I looked at this is kind of similar to the first one, whereas it says here including, and it goes on evaluating available data using first principles, mathematics, stats, natural science, and engineering principles. I again just kind of took that to mean, you don't necessarily need to have examples of them all. You can choose, or you can use that as one kind of broad subject about first principles. And the second part, where it says using engineering judgment to work with information that may be uncertain or incomplete, discussing limitations of techniques employed, I felt it was important to talk about those parts, that they were the more mandatory part of it. So you're using first principles, but then that's the bit you really need to focus on in the engineering judgment and what was the uncertain and incomplete data. Okay, so a bit about some tips for the interview. So as with the professional review, I would recommend that you undertake mock interviews, and it would be beneficial if the interviewers were familiar with the learning objectives that you're trying to satisfy, which will be more of an issue because reviewers will be more familiar with the chartered criteria than they are with this, so they'll probably have to read the learning objectives and familiarise themselves with it. In my interview, the reviewers were satisfied with all my learning objectives apart from sustainability. So the interview was really focused around sustainability for me, and they asked a lot of questions about sustainable materials and carbon calculations, and hence why I would say that would be something it would be worth considering in your submission. And just the other thing to say is, in hindsight, that I can appreciate that it's a positive thing to have the interview, because potentially the reviewer sort of had a gap there in that subject, but after having undertaken the review, then I was able to pass that learning objective. And the final one for me is just to explain how the experiential learning process does help to set you up for the professional review as well. So with my professional review submission, competence A and B, which are the kind of technical competencies, were almost entirely taken from the experiential learning submission and just slightly reformatted. So there wasn't really a lot of additional work for those two competences. And the same with competence D, which is the communication and interpersonal skills. Most of this was taken from my teamwork and communication sections of the experiential learning submission. It was only really competence C and competence E, which are the management ones and the personal and professional commitment that aren't covered in experiential learning. So those ones were from scratch, but you can see that 3 of the 5 competences, a lot of the information you need should be in your experiential learning submission. Okay, that was the last slide from me, Sue.
Right. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing your experience of going through the process. And obviously it had a happy ending, your story, because you are now a chartered engineer. And we know that many CIHT members have substantial engineering experience, but for whatever reason, they haven't actually got round to putting themselves forward to applying for professional registration. We're hoping that this new experiential learning option will encourage some of those people to put their head above the parapet and at least go through the initial stage of finding out through initial assessment whether or not they're eligible to apply. So if that's you listening to this webinar, as I said earlier, initial assessment, very straightforward. There's no charge for it. And at least you will know from the get-go whether or not you're eligible for this particular option. If you've been through initial assessment previously, it would be a good idea to just touch base again, because obviously this option is new and you do need to, you will need to have your CV and qualifications matched against the experiential learning criteria. So overall, Paul's experience, very positive one. Even though everybody's evidence is different, the hints and tips that you've heard from Paul will apply to everybody. The reading the learning outcomes carefully, thinking about not just presenting your knowledge, but the way that you critically analyze what you're talking about, so you show that depth of knowledge. As I mentioned earlier, any queries or any further information you need on this can be provided by CIHT's education team. So we'll leave it there for now. Thank you for listening. And we hope that it's inspired some of you to make 2024 the year that you actually progress your CEng aspirations. Thank you.